They announced it at my own retirement party. Not a quiet conversation in an office. Not a phone call the night before. My son stood up in front of 200 people, employees I'd hired, vendors I'd shaken hands with for 30 years. My own sister, who'd flown in from Phoenix, and told the room I was stepping aside. He used the word gracefully. He said I was transitioning gracefully into an advisory role. He raised his glass and asked everyone to toast the next chapter of Harmon Mechanical. I was sitting 6 feet away from him when he said it. I hadn't been told. Not that week. Not that month. The first time I heard the words advisory role was the same moment everyone else did. I set my glass down on the white tablecloth. I didn't stand. I didn't interrupt. I looked at my son, 34 years old, wearing the Patagonia vest he'd started favoring after the new investors came in. And I smiled at him the way you smile when you understand something that the other person doesn't yet realize you understand. He took my smile as acceptance. That was his first mistake. Let me tell you what 38 years looks like. It looks like a 1986 Ford pickup with a broken heater, driving to a job site in January because the only employee you have called in sick, and the customer is a school district that will never hire you again if you miss the appointment. It looks like refinancing your house twice. It looks like your wife packing lunches every day for 11 years because eating out was a luxury the business couldn't afford yet. It looks like teaching your son how to read a blueprint before he could read a chapter book, because you wanted him to love what you'd built the same way you loved it. I built Harmon Mechanical from a license, a used van, and a credit card with a $4,000 limit. By the time my son joined the company at 26, we had 83 employees, 4 service territories across central Indiana, and municipal contracts with the city of Indianapolis that accounted for nearly half our annual revenue. I had spent 3 decades building something that worked quietly, reliably, and with a reputation that required no advertising. When he came in, I welcomed him. I stepped back. That's what you do when you love your child and you've built something worth passing on. What I didn't account for was the wife. She came with him. Not in the building at first, but in every conversation he had after he left it. I watched the changes the way you watch weather moving in from the west slowly, then all at once. The company needed a rebrand. The logo was dated. The name Harmon & Sons felt small. We needed a VP of strategy. We needed a new office in the Broad Ripple corridor. We needed investors who could accelerate our growth trajectory. Trajectory was a word my son had never used before he married her. I didn't fight it. I asked questions. I raised concerns through proper channels, in board meetings, in one-on-one conversations over coffee, in the way a man who built something brick by brick tries to protect it without humiliating the person who is supposed to carry it forward. Each time, I was told that the business had evolved, that I was thinking like a founder, not a CEO, that we needed to modernize, not preserve. He said the word legacy like it was something to be quietly filed away. The year before the party, I started paying closer attention. Not because I suspected my son, I want to be clear about that. I suspected the structure. I had spent my career understanding that companies don't fail because of bad intentions. They fail because of bad architecture. And when a new set of hands starts rearranging the load-bearing walls, it doesn't matter whether their intentions are good. I had an attorney I'd worked with for 20 years. Quiet man. Methodical. The kind of lawyer who reads every line of every document rather than summarizing the sections that seem relevant. I called him, and I told him I wanted to review the framework of how our municipal contracts were structured, not to protect myself from my son, to protect the contracts from what I was starting to see: a company that was growing faster than its infrastructure could support, run by people whose experience was in pitch decks rather than pipe fittings. What we did was clean, legal, fully disclosed to our CPA and filed correctly with the state. We moved the municipal service agreements into Harmon Mechanical Holdings, a separate LLC I'd established years earlier as a tax efficiency vehicle. The logic was straightforward, and the board at the time, mostly old guard, had approved it without much ceremony. The city contracts required a key person clause naming me by name as primary relationship holder. That wasn't leverage I manufactured. That was something the city had requested years ago because they dealt with contractor turnover before and they wanted continuity. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just the only one paying attention to the details. The party was on a Friday in October. The venue was a renovated event space near the canal that my son's wife had selected. Edison bulbs, white linens, a past appetizer situation that cost more than our first office lease. 200 people, a slideshow with music, remarks from a few longtime clients. It had been framed to me as a celebration of the company's 35th anniversary. My son took the microphone around 8 o'clock. He thanked the team. He thanked the clients. He said the word grateful 4 times. Then he said that every great organization reaches a moment when it must honor its roots while embracing its future, and that his father that I had given everything to build something remarkable, and that the most loving thing he could do was ensure that I got to enjoy the fruits of that work rather than carrying the weight of it into my 60s. Advisory role, graceful transition, new chapter. The room applauded. Someone near the back table gave a whoop. My sister looked at me with an expression I recognized. It's the face she made when we were children, and something had happened that she didn't know how to respond to. I looked at my son. He was watching me with something in his eyes that might have been guilt and might have been relief. I picked up my glass and I raised it toward him. I said, loudly enough for the table nearest me to hear, "Congratulations, son. Well done." He exhaled. He smiled. He thought I was moved. I wasn't moved. I was calculating. The next morning, I was at my attorney's office before 9. Not out of anger, out of the same discipline that had driven me to that school district job in a broken truck in January 1986. You don't make decisions from emotion when the stakes are real. You make them from preparation. My attorney laid the documents across the conference table. The municipal contracts, the key person clause, the LLC structure, the assignment limitations that required written approval before any transition of operational authority. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't want to do anything yet. I wanted to watch. For 3 days, I watched. My son sent a company-wide email on Monday announcing the transition. My name appeared in the 4th paragraph. My title had already been changed on the company website. By Tuesday afternoon, I received 2 calls from city procurement contacts, not formal, just checking in, the way men who've worked with you for 20 years call when something feels different. I told both of them I was still available, still engaged, and that nothing affecting our service agreements had changed. On Wednesday, the director of the city's facilities maintenance division called me directly. He said my name had been removed from the contract renewal paperwork and replaced with my son's. I thanked him for the call. I told him I would follow up. That afternoon, I called my son. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the efficient warmth he'd recently developed, the tone of a man who'd been coached on how to manage difficult conversations. I asked him whether he'd reviewed the municipal contract structure before changing the key person designation. He said the contracts belonged to the company. I asked him which company. A pause. Not long, but long enough. Harmon Mechanical, he said. I asked him whether he meant Harmon Mechanical LLC or Harmon Mechanical Holdings LLC. The second pause was longer. I told him gently, the way I used to tell him when he'd misread a blueprint as a teenager, that the municipal agreements were held by the holdings entity, not the operating company. I told him the key person clause had named me specifically at the city's request. I told him that reassigning those contracts required written notice to the city, a 60-day review period, and approval by the contract authority, which would involve my signature because I was the managing member of holdings. He said that couldn't be right. I told him it had been structured that way for 9 years, with board approval, with full disclosure to our accountant, and with the documentation filed in the same cabinet where we kept every other significant contract in the history of this company. You never told me, he said. I told him I had presented it at a board meeting 5 years ago. He had been on his phone for most of that meeting. The silence that followed was different from the one in my attorney's office. This one had weight to it. The weight of a man realizing that the floor he'd been standing on was not quite where he thought it was. "Dad," he said finally. I told him we should talk in person. I told him I would come to the office the following morning. "My office," he said carefully. "Yes," I replied. "Your office." I arrived at 7:30. The receptionist, a young woman who had started with us 8 months ago and clearly had not been briefed on the situation, waved me through with a smile. The building still smelled the same machine oil and industrial carpet and the particular institutional coffee that someone had been brewing in the break room since before my son was old enough to drive. I took the stairs. His office was on the 2nd floor, the same office I had occupied for 22 years before passing it to him 3 years ago. I had not asked for it back. I had not asked for anything, actually. That was something he was only now beginning to understand. He was already there, standing by the window that looked out over the service yard. 3 of our trucks were pulling out for morning routes. Good crews. Men who had been with me for 15 and 20 years. He turned when I came in, and he looked like my son, not the executive version, not the one who used words like trajectory and rebrand, but the boy who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of the pickup after job sites when he was 7 years old. You knew this might happen, he said. I told him I knew that companies change when ownership changes, and that I had learned a long time ago never to confuse a title with a foundation. He sat down. I sat across from him. He asked me whether I had done it to punish him. I told him no. I had done it because I spent 38 years building something real, and I had a responsibility to protect it from market volatility, from operational overreach, from the kind of growth that looks impressive in a pitch deck and unsustainable 18 months later. The holding structure was not a trap. It was a roof. He was quiet for a while. Outside the window, another truck was backing toward the loading dock. Then he asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted the company to be stable. I wanted the municipal contracts honored. I wanted the men and women who had given their working lives to Harmon Mechanical to still have jobs in 5 years. And you? He asked. I told him I wasn't interested in reclaiming a title. He said that wasn't what he was asking. I understood. He was asking whether I wanted an apology, whether I wanted to be acknowledged, whether the retirement party and the announcement and the word gracefully had cost something that couldn't be covered by a structural conversation about contract assignments. I took a moment before I answered. I told him that what I wanted was to be consulted, not controlled, not obeyed, consulted. I told him there was a difference between a father stepping back and a father being erased, and that he had chosen the wrong one without meaning to, and that I believed he hadn't meant to, and that this right here, in this office, with both of us being honest, was the only thing I actually needed. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I should have asked you first. Those 5 words did more than any toast at any party could have done. We spent the next 2 hours at his desk reviewing the holdings documentation, together, not confrontationally. The way you go over blueprints, line by line, because the line is what matters, not who drew it. He had a cleaner grasp of the structure than I expected once he stopped defending his assumptions and started reading. That had always been one of his strengths. Once he decided to actually understand something, he understood it fast. By 10 o'clock, his wife had texted him 3 times. I could tell by the way he silenced his phone. I didn't ask about her. That was a conversation for a different room. The city director called that afternoon. I had left him a message the previous evening, explaining that the transition paperwork had been submitted prematurely and would need to be reprocessed through the correct entity. He was relieved in the way that city officials are relieved when a problem they don't want to explain to their supervisor disappears quietly. You're still the name on this contract, he said. For the time being, I told him, and the service won't be affected. He thanked me. I thanked him. We had been having versions of this conversation for 19 years. Over the following week, I learned more than I wanted to about what had been happening in the company during the months before the party. 3 of the new hires brought in by my son's wife's referral network had not been vetted through our standard process. 2 vendor relationships had been restructured with terms that looked favorable in year 1 and looked considerably less favorable in years 2 and 3. A rebranding proposal had been approved. The Harmon & Sons name was slated to be retired in January. None of this had been discussed with me. I didn't bring it to my son as an accusation. I brought it as a report, quietly, in writing, with supporting documentation attached, the way I had always communicated about things that mattered. I had spent my career being the man who didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. The numbers said whatever needed to be said. He read the report. He called me that evening. She was trying to help, he said. I knew he meant his wife. I knew he also knew that helping and overreaching were not the same thing. I told him I believed that. I told him I didn't think this was a story about bad intentions. I thought it was a story about pace, about moving faster than the structure could support, about confusing momentum with stability. He asked me whether I would come back. Not as a figurehead, as an actual participant in decisions that affected the long-term health of the company. I told him that was worth discussing. We met with the attorney the following week, my son and I, not adversarially together. We restructured the holdings entity to operate as a formal strategic consulting agreement with the operating company. Multi-year contract. Defined scope, my signature on the city agreements, with a succession clause that would transfer authority to my son after a 3-year relationship building period with the municipal contacts. It wasn't a reversal of what he'd built. It was a foundation underneath it. His wife did not attend that meeting. I don't know what conversations they had at home. I didn't ask, because that was between them. What I know is that when he walked into that attorney's office, he walked in as my son, not as the man who'd stood at a microphone and described my life's work as a route that needed to be grown past. My sister called me the week after the party, once things had settled enough for me to explain what had happened. She said she had been furious on my behalf. She said she had nearly said something at the table. I told her I was glad she hadn't. She asked me how I had stayed so calm. I told her calm was the only tool I'd ever found that worked when everything else was breaking. She said that was a very dad thing to say. I told her she wasn't wrong. 6 months after the party, Harmon Mechanical, operating under a refined structure, with the holdings agreement formalized and the 3-year vendor contracts renegotiated to more balanced terms, had its strongest fiscal quarter in 8 years. My son ran the day-to-day operations. I held the municipal relationships and handled 2 or 3 strategic decisions per quarter, the ones that required the kind of judgment that doesn't come from an MBA program or a pitch deck. The rebranding had been shelved. The name still said Harmon & Sons on the trucks. I drove past a job site one morning in early spring, a school in the district I'd worked in since the beginning, back when I was the only employee and the truck had a broken heater. My son's crew was there. A young guy, maybe 23, 24, was carrying equipment up a ramp with the particular focused look of someone who is learning that real work takes longer than you expect and matters more than you planned. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. There's something that takes a long time to understand about building something, whether it's a business or a family or a life. And it's this: the people who try to erase you rarely understand what they're erasing. They see the surface, the title, the office, the name on the masthead. They don't see the architecture. They don't see the 19-year relationship with a city director who calls you directly when something doesn't feel right. They don't see the vendor who has honored your terms for 11 years because you honored his during the quarter when he almost went under. They don't see the clause in the contract that no one read closely because nothing had ever required it to be read closely before. You don't protect that kind of structure by fighting. You protect it by building it correctly in the first place, and then by waiting with whatever patience you have for the moment when the architecture speaks for itself. My son and I have lunch on Thursdays now. Not every week. Most weeks. We go to the same diner I used to take him to on Saturdays when he was small. The kind of place where the coffee is bad and the portions are large, and the waitress has worked there long enough to know your order before you sit down. We don't always talk about the company. Sometimes we talk about nothing in particular. Sometimes he asks questions about the early years, the school district job, the refinancing, the stretches when I genuinely didn't know whether the business would survive the month. Last week he asked me when I knew I was going to be okay. I thought about it for a while. I told him it was the morning after the party, when I walked into the attorney's office and put the documents on the table and understood, clearly and without drama, that I had never stopped being necessary. Not to prove a point, not to win anything, just because 38 years of preparation tends to outlast a moment of disregard. He nodded. He stirred his coffee. Then he said, quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad, for the way I did it." I told him I knew. I told him I had known from the moment he raised his glass at the party and tried to make something uncomfortable look like a celebration. I told him that a man who is truly trying to hurt his father does not look guilty while he does it. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. The check came and we split it the way we always do now, not because I can't cover it, but because that's the structure we settled into when things became honest between us. Equal, deliberate, built correctly. I drove home through downtown Indianapolis, the river on one side, and the buildings my city has put up and torn down over 40 years on the other. The trucks were out on the road, our trucks, the ones that said Harmon & Sons in the same font they'd said it in for 30 years. I am 63 years old. I do not need the title. I do not need the office. I do not need anyone to announce my contributions at a party. What I needed was never to be erased. And I made sure, quietly, before anyone thought to try, that I never could be. If you've ever built something, a business, a career, a family, and watched someone try to move past you like you were merely a step in their staircase, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you built and what it cost and whether it was worth it. Because in my experience, the answer is always yes. It's always worth it, especially on the mornings when the trucks pull out and the work continues and the name is still on the door. Subscribe and stay with us. We share stories like this every week, stories about patience, about preparation, and about the quiet kind of strength that doesn't need an audience to be real.